New York's a lucky city, at least as far as literature is concerned. Every few decades, it produces a writer who tells its stories, its triumphs, its tragedies, its comedies, its romance. About 30 years ago, the job fell to me, Jay McInerney. A fair number of reviewers of my first novel, Bright Light's Big City, invoked the name of F Scott Fitzgerald. His work hadn't made a deep impression on me up until that point, but I returned to it then and fell under its spell.
I beg your pardon. Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you. Alone.
His masterwork, The Great Gatsby, has already been filmed 4 times. A 5th version, directed by Baz Luhrmann, will reach cinemas this summer.
I'm certainly glad to see you again.
I'm certainly glad to see you as well.
Gatsby embodies the American dream of self-invention. A man who reinvents himself for love, just as Fitzgerald would, not once, but twice. He captured the reckless post-war spirit of youth in the roaring 20s, the flappers and the parties and the bootleg liquor, the inevitable reckoning and the hangover to come. Fitzgerald never wrote an autobiography. He left us something better. Letters. Letters to editors or publishers or lovers or friends. Some signed faithfully, some ever yours, but almost always meant sincerely, F. Scott Fitzgerald. On January 10th, 1918, Francis Scott Fitzgerald was in an army camp in Kansas, waiting for the call that would take his company to France and war in the trenches. To pass the time, he'd been writing a novel. Before it was quite finished, he paused to write a friend about it.
There are 23 chapters, all but 5 are written. And really, if the publishers take it, I know I'll wake up some morning and find that the debutantes have made me famous overnight. I really believe that no one else could have written so searchingly the story of the youth of our generation. God, how I miss my youth.
The aspiring author was all of 22. And he was in love with his future wife, Zelda Sayre. Zelda's home was near his military base, but she wasn't sure that Scott was worth marrying. Both Scott and Zelda seemed solidly middle class, but in fact, Scott's family had no money. His Princeton college education had been paid for by his grandfather. The uniform hid a multitude of financial sins. With no prospect of inherited wealth, his novel was an essential tool in his seduction kit. In fact, apart from his good looks, it was all he had. He was convinced that if he finished it and published it, he would get the girl. He sent it to a New York publisher, Scribner's. They rejected it twice. And Zelda, after briefly accepting his proposal of marriage, rejected him too. The war ended. Fitzgerald moved to New York and got a job in advertising. But he didn't stop writing. He couldn't. Writing, even letter writing, was a vital part of what he needed to see in the mirror every morning. Without it, he was just another face in the crowd. So he rewrote his novel, renamed it This Side of Paradise, and sent it off once again to Scribner's. On September 18th, 1919, he received a reply from a junior editor named Maxwell Perkins. The answer was yes. He wrote straight back.
Dear Mr. Perkins, I've been in a sort of trance all day. Not that I doubted you'd take it, but at last I have something to show people. Terms, etc., I leave to you. But would it be utterly impossible for you to publish the book Christmas, or say by February? Have so many things dependent on its success, including, of course, a girl. Excuse this ghastly handwriting, but I'm a bit nervous today.
Of course he was nervous. He'd written the book in part to get the girl. So the news that he was about to become a published novelist was only half the news he needed. It worked. Zelda took him back. F Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Sayre got married here in St. Patrick's Cathedral, New York, on the 30th of March, 1920. It was a small affair, conducted in the vestry. This Side of Paradise had been in print 4 days. A novel described by its author as a bad book full of good things. A novel about flappers written for philosophers. It had been selling faster than its publisher could print it, complete with a cover that those attending the wedding must have smiled at, because they were only 2 or 3 paces from the people it was modeled on. Scott was the novel's hero, Amory Blaine. Zelda was the heroine, Rosalind. The classic flapper girl, flirting, kissing, viewing life lightly, saying damn without a blush. After the wedding, Scott and Zelda went straight to the Biltmore Hotel. Straight back to the party that people were beginning to believe they stood for as the perfect jazz-age couple. They started dancing, flirting, kissing, drinking.
A quart of Bushmills whiskey. Then out into the freshly bewitched city, through strange doors into strange apartments, with intermittent swings along in taxis through the soft nights. From the confusion of the year 1920, I remember riding on top of a taxicab along deserted Fifth Avenue on a hot Sunday night. And writing all night, again and again. The first speakeasies had arrived. The toddle was passé. Within a few months, we scarcely knew any more who we were, and we hadn't a notion what we were. And we were quoted on a variety of subjects we knew nothing about. To what extent do you think that Scott and Zelda collaborated in dramatizing their own life, in creating their own myth?
They worked hard on that legend, particularly when they were young and when they were really inseparable. They loved telling stories about each other, glamorizing each other, building each other up, exaggerating stories that had actually happened. They were both performers. They were both very good actors. This is who I'm going to be today. This is how I'm going to dress. They dressed for the part. Zelda was very emphatic about dresses. Today can't be a pearl gray dress. It has to be a dress the color of fresh green paint because it's spring. They dressed for the parts. They looked the parts.
Scott talks about the way in which he felt that they were ultimately unable to live up to the role that the public expected of them. And yet it seems to me that for a time they really did, and that they really together symbolized the era of the era that Scott had partly created in his fiction, the era of the flapper, the jazz age, New York in the early days of Prohibition.
The two of them together, working in tandem, were so highly symbolic of everything that was bright and white and light in New York City at the time. And they were going to remain frozen in that golden moment forever.
In an unguarded moment, his life was full of those. F. Scott Fitzgerald once admitted that he wasn't sure whether he and Zelda were real or characters in one of his own novels. The first producers of a movie version of Paradise were equally unsure They asked Scott and Zelda to play the lead roles. Scott's publisher finally convinced him that it would be unwise. Life imitates art, they say, but in the case of F. Scott Fitzgerald, there often seemed to be no difference between the two. Journalists visited and found him difficult to distinguish from the people he'd written. New York Tribune, May 7th, 1920. With the distinct intention of taking Mr. Fitzgerald by surprise, I ascended to the 25th floor of the Biltmore and knocked in the best waiter manner at the door. On entering, my first impression was one of confusion, a sort of rummage sale confusion. A young man was standing in the center of the room. "I'm looking for my hat," he said dazedly. "How do you do?" He seemed slightly tipsy, both amused and bemused. And his wife was loosely based on several of his paragraphs.
Rosalind is utterly Rosalind. She wants what she wants when she wants it, and she is prone to make everyone around her pretty miserable when she doesn't get it. But in the true sense, she is not spoiled. Her fresh enthusiasm, her will to grow and learn, her endless faith in the inexhaustibility of romance, her courage, and fundamental honesty, these things are not spoiled.
In October of 1921, Zelda gave birth to a daughter. When the child was placed in her arms, Zelda, still befuddled from the ether, muttered, "Oh God, Gufo, I'm drunk. Isn't she smart? She has the hiccups. I hope it's beautiful in a fool. A beautiful little fool." Fitzgerald wrote that down, saved it for later. They christened the child Francis Scott Fitzgerald, Francis with an E. They called her Scotty. And back they went to the party, baby and all.
Girls were girls and boys were boys when I was a tot. Now we don't know who is who or even what's what. Knickers and trousers, baggy and wide, nobody knows who's walking inside. Those masculine women and feminine men.
Through it all, he remained astonishingly productive. A book of short stories, a second novel, another collection.
Dear Mr. Perkins, here are some suggested blurbs. Tales of the Jazz Age, satire upon a saxophone by the most brilliant of the younger novelists. A medley of bathtubs, Diamond Mountains, Fitzgerald flappers, and jelly beans.
These books did nothing to disturb his public image as the Jazz Age author. But Fitzgerald was getting tired of all that, increasingly aware that as long as he didn't write anything radically different, he couldn't complain that the articles written about him all seemed to have the same kinds of titles. Flapper novelist, Flapperdom's fiction ace. He wanted to write something lasting, a or the great American novel. In October of 1922, Scott, Zelda, and their baby daughter moved out to Long Island, a place called Great Neck. The last 80 years have filled in a lot of the gaps. In 1922, Great Neck was more a place of parks and mansions. The parties in Great Neck were studded with celebrities. Scott and Zelda held as many as they could themselves in their more modest residence. And when Great Neck was quiet, Manhattan was hazily visible across Long Island Sound, like a memory that you could actually revisit, only 30 minutes away, if you drove dangerously fast. Slowly, a new story began to form in Fitzgerald's mind.
I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited. They went there. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. And after that, they conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with an amusement park.
Blocked in Long Island, Fitzgerald took his unfinished manuscript and his family to Europe. To the Riviera first. It was somehow better if Manhattan and Long Island were more distant memories. But Zelda felt like luggage, something attached to the arm of the fashionable young novelist. It wasn't enough. She fell for a young French aviator in a white duck uniform who used to buzz their house in his biplane. She asked for a divorce. Fitzgerald refused. The aviator went away, taking Scott's youth with him. Fitzgerald wrote his best man, "Dear Lud, I remember our last conversation and it makes me sad. I feel old, too, this summer. That's the whole burden of this novel, the loss of those illusions that give such color to the world, so that you don't care whether things are true or false, as long as they partake of the magical glory." The finished script went back across the Atlantic in October of 1924. Completed at the same time as Scott and Zelda reassembled their relationship, it was indeed a novel about lost illusions, a novel in which the central character, Jay Gatsby himself, was never clearly described, apart from his smile. The novel is told to us by an observer of the events, Nick Carraway. There's a lot of reported speech. This person said this person said that. And Gatsby himself remains largely a reported figure. "I'm Gatsby," he said suddenly. "What?" I exclaimed. "Oh, I beg your pardon." "I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host." He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole eternal world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point, it vanished. And I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or 2 over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. He remains shadowy and indistinct, and thus glamorous and mysterious. We never really see him more clearly. There are bit parts which receive clearer descriptions. The girls in yellow dresses at Gatsby's parties. Meyer Wolfsheim, the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. Whenever the camera of Fitzgerald's prose approaches Gatsby, the focus is soft, indefinite. Maxwell Perkins responded to the manuscript with a letter of delighted congratulation. He asked questions. Why, in particular, was Gatsby so indistinct a figure?
Dear Max, I'm a bit, not dangerously stewed tonight. I myself didn't know what Gatsby looked like or was engaged in. It seems of almost mystical significance to me that you thought he was older. After having had Zelda draw pictures until her fingers ache, I feel I know Gatsby better than I know my own child.
Fitzgerald was lying, to himself as much as to Max. Gatsby's face was entirely familiar to him. He saw it every time he shaved. His creative methods hadn't changed. His art and his life were still inextricably mixed. For the plot of The Great Gatsby, a story of lost love, he had cannibalized his own life.
He went back as far as 1917 to the first broken engagement with Zelda. Scott had met Zelda when he was a lieutenant stationed near her home in Alabama, waiting to be shipped to France to fight. In the book, Jay Gatsby, a poor boy from a humble Midwestern family, falls in love with Daisy Fay, the belle of Louisville, Kentucky. They meet while he's stationed at the nearby army base, waiting to be deployed overseas. She knows nothing of his poor background. It's hidden by the officer's uniform. His real name, Jimmy Gatz, is already hidden, too. He wins Daisy's heart, but while he's away at war, her devotion wavers. She marries an obscenely wealthy man. To recapture her, Gatsby sets about making himself equally wealthy by selling bootleg liquor.
By the time the book begins, the transformation is complete. Gatsby is the owner of a huge mansion bought only because it's across the bay from Daisy's house. At night, he can see the light at the end of her dock.
One night, the novel's narrator, Nick Carraway, is sitting outside his house.
I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward, and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness.
The novel borrowed their marriage for its central tensions. Not something, given the present state of that marriage, that Fitzgerald himself could easily admit. But the novel could.
The presence of Zelda inside of Daisy would have been obvious as soon as Zelda read what Daisy said about her child. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool.
In the novel, Daisy fails Gatsby. But Gatsby struggles to recapture what they've lost, just as his author hoped that this new book would recharge him in his wife's eyes. The book is lit from within by Fitzgerald's desperate yearning for the early days of his love for Zelda. His anguish that those carefree days are over, and his refusal to accept that they could not be recovered.
I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past? He cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see.
The result of all this anguished creativity was the finest novel Fitzgerald ever wrote, and perhaps the finest novel ever written in America. It captured the American obsession with the idea that anyone can reinvent themselves, the American dream, and captured, too, the reality that the American dream retreats before us, always out of reach. Today we revere first editions of Gatsby, treat them almost as holy writ.
So Glenn, we have here an object that I covet personally, and that tells a story about Fitzgerald. Could you
I would be delighted
show
to.
us this?
In this brown Morocco slipcase is a copy of the first English edition, lacking the remarkably rare jacket of The Great Gatsby.
Yeah. This is not exactly in mint condition.
No, I would say that under the best of circumstances, you might describe it as a little less than beat. But what distinguishes this copy is the full-page inscription in 1928 from Fitzgerald to Alan Campbell, the husband of his great friend Dorothy Parker. This is the only extant copy of the first English edition with an inscription by Fitzgerald.
And at the risk of sounding crass, can you tell me how much it's worth?
What it is worth and what it will sell for may be two slightly different things, but it's worth somewhere in the region of 150,000 American dollars.
Whoa.
This book, absent the inscription, in this condition would be worth somewhere in the range of maybe $1,000.
And what if this were an American edition? What would a copy of the first edition of The Great Gatsby, let's say with a dust jacket, what would this be worth?
A friend of mine in New York City owns a beautiful copy in a jacket inscribed in 1926 of the first edition, first printing. A year ago, he turned down an offer that I had made to him for $750,000 for the book. $750,000 for the book.
It's only now that first editions of Gatsby have such value. In 1925, very few people were willing to pay the cover price because Fitzgerald had forgotten his original audience. He was known for stories in which young men from Ivy League colleges danced and drank with fashionable flapper girls, in which everyone did their best to understand themselves and each other, and had a damn good time while they were doing it. And now, the oracle of the Jazz Age had written a novel in which the college boy is really only a bystander, in which a man married to a beauty has a blousy, fleshy girlfriend, and the beauty runs a car over the mistress and kills her, and the man willing to take the rap for her is a bootlegging liar and fraud, who also happens to be the novel's hero. Reinvented himself too thoroughly. At the same time as rewriting his own history, he leapt ahead of his audience. And naturally enough, his creature suffered from the same disease.
Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
The novel sold 22,000 copies, less than half the figure for this side of paradise. Great reviews, but disappointing sales. Not what Fitzgerald desperately needed. And the novel posed a question at the very heart of their marriage. Did its continued existence depend upon things that inevitably perish?
A careful observer might have seen him getting off the train in Los Angeles in 1937. A little fleshier, a lot more lines, a lot more tentative, minus the trademark center part. F Scott Fitzgerald, arriving in Hollywood.
It was actually Fitzgerald's third attempt to make it in the movies, but by 1937, he had no other options. It was Hollywood or bust. The F. Scott Fitzgerald who arrived in Hollywood in 1937 was an entirely different man from the man who'd married Zelda in 1920.
Zelda was in a mental hospital back east, a diagnosed schizophrenic. Fitzgerald was no longer fashionable. in any sense. His last novel, Tender as the Night, had sold poorly. The second printing of Gatsby was rotting in a warehouse.
And then there was the booze. It was no secret. A year before he got to Hollywood, Fitzgerald had been front-page news in the New York Evening Post. The article described Fitzgerald as a sodden and despairing alcoholic. Now he was on the wagon, in a city where alcohol was the universal solvent. So Fitzgerald sneaked into Hollywood, convinced that anyone who recognized him would be thinking, there goes Scott Fitzgerald, the famous drunk. Scott's agent, Harold Ober, had organized everything in advance. Ober was more than an agent. Father, brother, banker, all rolled into one. He and his wife Anne looked after Scotty when Fitzgerald couldn't, lent him money when he ran out. Ober had even arranged a hotel. Its name was an unintended joke at the expense of the faded author of This Side of Paradise. It was called the Garden of Allah. The Garden of Allah was a place where some of the faces were famous, and the people they drank with and paid for sex were not. The walls of the rooms were proverbially thin. A great place to get material if you're a writer, but not a great place for a recovering alcoholic. Scott picked up a postcard at reception, wrote a message on the back of it, addressed it to himself.
Dear Scott, how are you? Have been meaning to come in and see you. I have living at the Garden of Allah. Yours, Scott Fitzgerald. I have living. The missing word is been. How are you might as well be who are you. Stamped but not mailed. Mailing it might have been taking the joke too far.
Fitzgerald checked in at MGM Studios, now the home of Columbia Pictures, the day after he arrived in LA, even though it was a Saturday. He was desperate to remake his name. But writers had no special place. They worked in teams. He wrote to Scotty. She was 16 now. He called her Pi.
Dear Pi, I must keep my hand on the wheel from the start, find out the key man among the bosses and the most malleable among the collaborators, then fight the rest tooth and nail until I'm alone on the picture. That's the only way I can do my best work.
On his first job, as one of a team writing the dialogue for A Yank at Oxford, Fitzgerald was painfully timid. Struggling to rebrand himself as sober, he sat silent at lunch, Coke bottle in hand. After a little more than 2 weeks in Hollywood, Fitzgerald wrote to Harold Ober's wife, Anne.
I've seen Hollywood. Talked with Taylor, dined with Frederick March, danced with Ginger Rogers. This will burn Scotty up, but it's true. Been in Rosalind Russell's dressing room, wisecracked with Robert Montgomery, drunk ginger ale with Zucker and Lasky, lunched alone with Maureen O'Sullivan, watched Joan Crawford act, and lost my heart to a beautiful half-caste Chinese girl whose name I've forgotten. From now on, I go nowhere and see no one because the work is hard as hell. So farewell, mysterious Garbo, glamorous Dietrich, exotic Shirley Temple. You will never know me. Yours with gratitude and devotion, Scott.
It's a convincing, stiff upper lip of a letter, but actually it was dialogue. Good dialogue. Dialogue nevertheless.
A letter written by the character Fitzgerald was trying to become, the phenomenally successful Hollywood screenwriter. And after the initial disappointment of a Yank at Oxford, it actually seemed to be working. He was given the job of adapting a novel for the screen, Three Comrades. He was guaranteed a screen credit, and he began to enjoy himself. He wrote to Ann Ober, wife of his agent Harold.
Dear Anne, I love it here. It's nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you try, about 3 years. The point is, once you've got it, screen credit first, a hit second, and the Academy Award third, you can count on it forever. Ever affectionately, Scott Fitz.
He wrote to Maxwell Perkins, "Everyone is very nice to me, surprised and rather relieved that I don't drink. I'm happier than I've been in several years." He could have added, there was, of course, a girl. Sheila Graham was too good to be true. An upper-class English rose, engaged when Fitzgerald first met her to the Marquis of Donegal, and yet she still had a job as a gossip columnist. She would later confess to Fitzgerald that her real name was Lily Shiel and that she'd been raised in an orphanage. Everything about her was fake. Her accent was fake. Her biography was fake. The engagement to the Marquis was real enough, but Sheila Graham and Fitzgerald had far too much in common for that to matter. She was a kind of female Gatsby. Hollywood was the right place for them. Scott and Sheila were stories as much as they were people, stories they told themselves as well as each other. Years later, Sheila wrote a memoir of their affair. She described the first moment she ever saw him.
I stared at him, not sure whether I saw him or not. A slight, pale man who appeared to be all shades of the palest, most delicate blue. His hair was pale, his face was pale, his suit was blue, his eyes, his lips were blue. I turned to laugh with Frank Morgan. Bob spoke to me. When I looked again, the chair was empty.
Ring any bells?
When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness.
At the next party, they spoke, and a couple of parties after that, they danced. "We danced the tango," she wrote. "I thought, this man is not 40. He's a young man. He's a college boy. He's utterly delightful." She looked, or he thought she looked, he convinced himself she looked like Zelda.
Can't repeat the past? He cried incredulously. Why, of course you can.
3 weeks after they'd met, Sheila Graham went out for a meal with her 40-year-old college boy and his 16-year-old daughter, Scotty. And Sheila watched her college boy transform into a nervous, controlling dad, constantly correcting Scotty's posture, urging her to eat her peas. Fitzgerald wrote hundreds of letters to Scotty, mostly designed to stop her being him. So Scott wrote a lot of letters to his daughter. What kind of qualities did you find in those letters?
Well, if I'd been getting those letters, I would have had a very hard time reading them. They were very stern and always setting a higher standard for her than he perceived her to be setting for herself. Full of advice. This letter has always struck me. He wrote to her in 1938. He writes, "When I was your age, I lived with a great dream. The dream grew and I learned how to speak of it and make people listen. Then the dream divided one day when I decided to marry your mother after all, even though I knew she was spoiled and meant no good to me. I was sorry immediately I had married her, but being patient in those days made the best of it and got to love her in another way. You came along, and for a long time we made quite a lot of happiness out of our lives. But I was a man divided. She wanted me to work too much for her and not enough for my dream. She realized too late that work was dignity, and the only dignity, and tried to atone for it by working herself. But it was too late, and she broke and is broken forever. Now that's very confidential in a way, although it is a rewriting of history.
This is really kind of hard news for a 17-year-old.
My mother had trouble reading these. She would set them aside and read them when she was in a good mood. And as the years went by, my mother said she developed a very thick hide about everything to do with her father. She adored him, so I know these letters mattered a lot. I mean, throughout this letter, I should read another part because that's a confidential section. But here goes. To sum up, what you have done to please me or make me proud is practically negligible since the time you made yourself a good diver at camp. When I do not feel you're going somewhere, your company tends to depress me for the silly waste and triviality involved. On the other hand, when occasionally I see signs of life and intention in you, there's no company in the world I would prefer.
What kind of father is he trying to be?
I think he's trying to be a mother and father at the same time, although a mother wouldn't be as harsh. My mother felt that he was writing the letters really to himself, that sometimes he was coaching himself in his best behavior, and other times he felt that if he had followed the advice that he was giving her, his life would have turned out better.
Even so, he signed the letters Daddy. When she was only 11, he wrote her a letter that must somehow have stayed with her, as the undertone of every letter afterwards. The advice was for her, the bitter experience was his, and he wanted it to stay that way.
Things to worry about. Worry about courage. Worry about cleanliness. Worry about efficiency. Things not to worry about. Don't worry about popular opinion. Don't worry about dolls. Don't worry about the past. Don't worry about the future. Don't worry about triumph. Don't worry about failure unless it comes through your own fault. Don't worry about mosquitoes. Don't worry about flies. Don't worry about insects in general. Don't worry about parents. Don't worry about boys.
In January 1938, Fitzgerald sat down to write a letter to the producer of Three Comrades, Joseph Mankiewicz. Mankiewicz had been working on Fitzgerald's finished script, like a child with a box of chalk, as Fitzgerald put it.
Dear Joe, I guess all these years I've been kidding myself about being a good writer. To say I'm disillusioned is putting it mildly. For 19 years, with 2 years out for sickness, I've written best-selling entertainment, and my dialogue is supposedly right up at the top, but I learned from the script that you've suddenly decided that it isn't good dialogue, and you can take a few hours off and do much better.
The rewritten film, he said, would confuse and depress everybody. Except for the 10-year-olds, who are so confused anyway that I can't believe they make or break a picture.
But Fitzgerald simply couldn't tell what was going to be a good picture and what wasn't. Three Comrades was released in a form that Fitzgerald thought sloppy and sentimental, but it got great reviews and did good business. It was a minor hit. So MGM increased his weekly salary and gave him Joan Crawford's next movie to write, Infidelity, a film which would explore the world of extramarital affairs.
By 1938, Fitzgerald expected failure. He was preternaturally attuned to its approach. His antenna twitched whenever it impended, and whenever it failed to. He expected 3 comrades to be a failure, and it succeeded. He expected infidelity to be a great success, and it was never even made.
Dearest Scotty, we have reached a censorship barrier in infidelity to our infinite disappointment. It won't be Joan's next picture, and we are setting it aside a while. I'm having a controversy with the Highland Hospital. They want to keep your mother there with only 6 weeks out a year. I think she should be out from 1/4 to 1/2 the time, using the hospital only as a base. If I insist, they threaten to release her altogether to me, which would be simply a catastrophe. I can't work and look after her. I don't dare at the moment to tell your mother that I've taken a shack at the beach here. She would feel as if we were happy and she was in prison.
The shack was a house. Sheila had found it for him. The rent was $250 a month, $50 less than the Garden of Allah.
The beach was better, but the housewarming party went awry. Struggling to swallow his disappointment at the cancellation of infidelity, Fitzgerald got drunk on gin and told fellow writer Nunnally Johnson to leave Hollywood before it ruined him. Johnson responded that he liked it here. Fitzgerald tried to punch him.
The advice, as always, had been aimed at himself. There was nothing in the mirror anymore he liked to see. He received a letter from a lady who said she was reading up on his life and works. She wanted a reading list. Fitzgerald responded with a list of non-existent books. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Image and the Man, Irene Kramer Thurston, 1937. The Women Who Knew F. Scott Fitzgerald, Marie, Comtesse de Ségur.
F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Rise of Islam, Harcourt, Brace, and Howe, 1912. I hope these books will serve your purpose, he wrote, and signed the letter J.P. Carmes, Secretary.
He couldn't be proud of the past. It seemed so far from the present. But the returns for screenwriting were diminishing too. He became known as the past master of the unfinished script. Moved from project to project, Fitzgerald was eventually loaned by MGM to David Selznick to work on Gone with the Wind. He was only allowed to use dialogue from the original novel. At the end of the year, MGM let him go. It was a relief.
Dear Harold, as I wrote you, the contract wasn't renewed. Why, I don't know, but not on account of the work. Baby, am I glad to get out. I've hated the place ever since Monkey Bitch rewrote 3 Comrades. Glad Scotty was nice. Sheila sends her best. Ever, Scott.
In May of 1939, Fitzgerald's letters give the first hints that he was intending to return to novel writing. He wrote both to Max Perkins and to Harold Ober, explaining that he'd already blocked the story out, that it would be about the length of Gatsby, that it would take him about 3 months to write.
That it was not, absolutely not, repeat, not underlined, about Hollywood.
The novel was about Hollywood. A thinly disguised retelling of the life of Irving Thalberg, the Midas touch producer who had died 2 years before, aged 37. The so-called boy wonder, whose work had made MGM the most successful studio of its day.
Was it good? Could Fitzgerald still write? Of course he could.
The back lot was 30 acres of fairyland. Not because the locations really looked like African jungles and French chateaus and schooners at anchor and Broadway by night. but because they looked like the torn picture books of childhood, like fragments of stories dancing in an open fire. I never lived in a house with an attic, but a back lot must be something like that. And at night, of course, in an enchanted, distorted way. It all comes true.
The question was, how could Fitzgerald support himself while he wrote the novel? Ever since his career began, his bread and butter had come from selling short stories to the American popular press. But he'd lost the knack. Apart from brief lapses, he'd been off the booze for a year and a half. His final binge began in April of 1939. It would last almost 9 months. Between drinking bouts, he worked on the novel.
Scottina, look, I have begun to write something that is maybe great, and I'm going to be absorbed in it for 4 or 6 months. I am alive again. I'm not a great man, but sometimes I think the impersonal and objective quality of my talent and the sacrifices of it, in pieces, to preserve its essential value, has some sort of epic grandeur. Anyhow, after hours I nurse myself with delusions of that sort. With dearest love, Daddy.
By November, Fitzgerald had written an outline and 6,000 or 7,000 words of completed prose. He ground to a halt, with a fragment of fiction too short to sell. He drank instead.
On the 1st of December, Fitzgerald assaulted the nurse he'd hired to moderate his alcohol intake, struck Sheila, and repeatedly threatened to kill her. She'd hidden his gun weeks before, or this might be a different story. Sheila called the police, and then she left him to die.
Sheila, it is very quiet out here now. I'm glad you're rid of me. I hope you're happy. And the last awful impression is fading a little till someday you'll say, he can't have been that black. Goodbye, Sheila. I won't bother you anymore. Scott.
On the frontispiece of The Great Gatsby, there is a poem by Thomas Park D'Invilliers.
Then wear the gold hat, if that will move her. If you can bounce high, bounce for her too, till she cry, lover, gold-hatted, high-bouncing lover, I must have you.
Thomas Park D'Invilliers does not exist, or he certainly didn't when Fitzgerald wrote the poem.
Fitzgerald bounced high for Sheila. He sent her flowers. He telephoned. At last, she took the call, and late in January, they came up here to Laurel Canyon, where pretty much nobody lived at the time, and she took him back.
This was our happiest time, Sheila wrote in her memoir. They visited Mexico. He wrote soberly and steadily. He created a new line of comic short stories about a failed screenwriter, which he sold to Esquire magazine. Began work adapting one of his own short stories for the screen. And between these paying jobs, in a small top-floor apartment in West Hollywood near Sunset Boulevard, pages of the first draft of The Love of the Last Tycoon slowly accumulated.
One day in November, he walked up to Sunset to Schwab's drugstore to buy cigarettes.
He felt faint and dizzy. A cardiogram revealed he'd suffered a mild heart attack. He moved to Sheila's house. There were less stairs. Fitzgerald's final letters are his final fantasies. The dream is that he will live to finish The Love of the Last Tycoon. He writes to Maxwell Perkins.
Dear Max, the novel progresses, in fact, progresses fast.
He writes, of course, to Scotty.
I'm still in bed, this time the result of 25 years of cigarettes. You have got 2 beautiful bad examples for parents. Just do everything we didn't do, and you will be perfectly safe.
And he writes to Zelda.
The novel is about 3/4 through, and I think I can go on till January 12th without doing any stories or going back to the studio. The cardiogram shows that my heart is repairing itself. It is odd that the heart is one of the organs that does repair itself.
His heart did not repair itself. Fitzgerald died of a massive heart attack in 1443 North Hayworth Avenue on December 21st, 1940. He was just 44 years old.
When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness.
People think of Fitzgerald's 3.5 years in Hollywood as failed years. But they remind me of his great novel, Gatsby. It deals with one of the central tenets of the American creed, the idea of self-invention, of the fresh start. Gatsby reinvented himself from scratch, and so did his creator.
In Hollywood, Fitzgerald was still somehow hopeful, still trying to recreate himself in his own eyes and in the eyes of others. He certainly succeeded for Sheila Graham, and for anyone who's read the pages he managed to complete of The Love of the Last Tycoon, a book which might well have taken its place alongside Gatsby, the novel which secured his claim on immortality, in which he wrote his own epitaph.
Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.